What if the greatest battle you will ever fight in your life is not out there in the world? Not against your enemies, not against your circumstances, not against the economy or the people who doubted you or the situations that blindsided you, but right here inside the quiet private territory of your own mind. What if every time you crumbled under pressure, every time anxiety swept in and took your clarity away, every time life knocked you down and you had nothing left to stand on? What if none of that was because life was too hard, but because your mind had never been trained to meet it? That is not a criticism. That is one of the most liberating things you will ever hear. Because if the problem lives in the mind, then so does the solution. Look at the people around you. Some of them come apart at the slightest friction. A difficult conversation and they shut down completely. A setback at work and they spiral for days. Uncertainty arrives and they freeze, paralyzed, unable to act. But then there are others. Rare people, exceptional people who face loss, crisis, devastation, and somehow remain upright. Who have everything taken from them and still find a way to rebuild. Who walk into the most painful chapters of their lives and emerge on the other side, not broken, but transformed. What separates these two groups is not intelligence. It is not background. It is not that life has been gentler to one than the other. The only difference is mental strength. One group has built it. The other group has not. Not yet. Mental strength is not what most people think it is. It is not hardness. It is not the refusal to feel. It is not pretending that pain is not real or that fear is a weakness to be ashamed of. Real mental strength is something far more powerful and far more human than any of that. It is the ability to feel everything, every surge of fear, every wave of grief, every whisper of doubt and still move forward anyway. It is the capacity to sit inside discomfort without letting it dictate your choices. It is the discipline of staying grounded and clear-headed in the very moments when everything inside you is screaming to run, to collapse, to give up. And it is without any question a skill, not a trait you were born with or without. A learnable, trainable, developable skill. Which means that right now, regardless of where you are starting from, you can build it. And that is exactly what this audiobook is going to teach you to do. By the time you finish this, you will think about pressure differently. You will respond to chaos differently. You will carry within you a quiet, rooted, unshakable confidence in your own ability to handle whatever this life decides to throw at you. Not because life will become easier, but because you will have become stronger than it. That transformation begins here. Chapter 1. The truth about mental strength, what it is and what it is not. Most people spend their entire lives chasing a version of mental strength that does not exist. They want the version where nothing gets to them, where pain bounces off, where fear never shows up, where they can stand in the middle of any storm and feel absolutely nothing. And because they are chasing something that is not real, they never actually build what is. So before anything else, before any strategy or technique or framework, you need to understand what mental strength actually is. Because the moment you get clear on that, everything changes. Let us start with what it is not. Mental strength is not the absence of emotion. Some of the most mentally strong people who have ever lived were also some of the most deeply feeling. They cried. They were afraid. They doubted themselves in the dark. They carried grief that would have broken most people. The difference was not that they felt less. The difference was that their emotions did not get to make their decisions for them. There is a massive gap between feeling fear and being controlled by fear. Mental strength lives in that gap. Mental strength is also not toughness in the way popular culture defines it. The idea that strong people never ask for help, never admit vulnerability, never let anyone see them struggle, that is not strength. That is a performance. And performances are exhausting. They cost you enormous energy that could be going toward actual resilience. The person who cannot admit when they are overwhelmed is not strong. They are brittle. They are one major crisis away from complete collapse because they have never learned to process difficulty. They have only learned to hide it. Real mental strength is something quieter and something far more durable than any of that. It is built on 3 foundations, and you need to understand all 3 of them before you can begin to develop them. The first foundation is awareness. Mental strength begins with the ability to see yourself clearly, to observe your own thoughts, your own emotional patterns, your own automatic responses to stress, without judgment, and without flinching. Most people go through life completely unaware of the mental programs running beneath the surface. They react without knowing they are reacting. They spiral without understanding why. Awareness is what breaks that cycle. You cannot change what you cannot see. The second foundation is regulation. Awareness tells you what is happening inside you. Regulation is the skill of choosing what to do with it. It is the practiced deliberate ability to feel an intense emotion without being swept away by it. To feel the pull toward panic and choose steadiness instead. To feel the urge to lash out and choose clarity instead. Regulation is not suppression. You are not pushing the emotion down or locking it in a box. You are learning to hold it without letting it hold you. This is a skill that can be developed through practice, and it is one of the most powerful things a human being can learn to do. The third foundation is resilience. This is the capacity to take a hit. A real hit. The kind that changes things. The kind that leaves a mark and not stay down. Resilience is not about bouncing back as if the difficult thing never happened. That is not human, and it is not real. Resilience is about integrating the experience, learning from it, carrying it forward as wisdom rather than as a wound that never heals. Resilient people are not people who have avoided suffering. They are people who have developed a relationship with suffering that does not destroy them. When you combine awareness, regulation, and resilience, you get something extraordinary. You get a person who can navigate life without being at the mercy of it. A person who can face uncertainty without needing certainty to move forward. A person who can lose, grieve, fail, and still believe in what they are building. That is the definition of unbreakable mental strength. Not invincibility, not the absence of pain, but the absolute refusal to let pain be the final word. And from this point forward, that is what you are building. Here is something important to understand as you begin this process. Mental strength is not a destination you arrive at. It is not a state where one day you wake up and nothing bothers you anymore. It is a daily practice, a set of choices you make consistently over time. Every moment you choose to face something uncomfortable instead of avoiding it, you are building it. Every time you catch your thoughts spiraling and bring them back to what you can control, you are building it. Every time you sit with difficult emotion, instead of numbing it, you are building it. The muscle of the mind is built exactly the way the muscle of the body is built, through consistent, deliberate, progressively challenging work. And just like with the body, the results of that work will show up in ways you never expected, in situations you never anticipated, precisely when you need the most. What you are embarking on in this audio book is not a quick fix. It is a complete reconstruction of the way you relate to difficulty, to pressure, to uncertainty, and to yourself. It will ask things of you. It will require your honesty. It will require your willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to understand it. But what it will give you in return is something no external circumstance can ever take away: a mind that holds no matter what. Chapter 2. The War Inside Your Mind. Understanding why you break down under pressure. There is a moment that almost everyone has experienced. Something happens, a sudden piece of bad news, an unexpected confrontation, a wave of uncertainty, and within seconds, your entire system changes. Your heart rate climbs. Your thoughts accelerate and scatter. Your chest tightens. Your ability to think clearly begins to dissolve, replaced by a kind of frantic inner noise that makes rational decision-making feel almost impossible. You know somewhere in the back of your mind that you should stay calm, that this is manageable, that panicking will not help. And yet you cannot stop it. The spiral takes over. You break down. Why does this happen? Why do intelligent, capable, well-intentioned people, people who genuinely want to remain composed, fall apart under pressure? The answer is not weakness. The answer is biology. And once you understand what is actually happening inside your brain and body during these moments, you gain something incredibly powerful. The ability to intervene before the breakdown takes hold. Your brain has a region called the amygdala, often described as the brain's alarm system. Its job is survival. It has been doing that job for hundreds of thousands of years, long before modern life existed, long before deadlines and job interviews and relationship conflicts and financial pressures. The amygdala does not distinguish between a predator chasing you and an email from your boss that fills you with dread. To the amygdala, a threat is a threat. And when it detects one, it does what it was designed to do. It triggers a cascade of stress responses that prepare your body to fight or flee. Cortisol floods your bloodstream. Adrenaline spikes. Blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational thought, perspective, creativity, and sound judgment, and toward your muscles and your instincts. In a life or death situation, this is brilliant. In the situations most people face in modern life, it is catastrophic. Because here is what happens when the prefrontal cortex goes offline under stress. You lose access to your best thinking. You become impulsive. You see threats everywhere and solutions nowhere. You catastrophize. Your mind races toward the worst possible outcome and treats it as certainty. You lose the ability to zoom out and see the bigger picture. You become in a very real neurological sense less capable of handling the exact situation you are facing. The very system designed to protect you ends up making things worse. This is why people say things in anger they cannot take back. This is why people make decisions under pressure that they later recognize as completely irrational. This is why intelligent people sometimes behave in ways that seem to contradict everything they know about themselves. It is not a character flaw. It is a hijacked nervous system, and knowing that it is happening is the first step toward doing something about it. But there is more to the breakdown than just the amygdala response. The second layer is what you might call the story problem. When pressure hits, your brain does not just react chemically. It also begins constructing a narrative around what is happening. And almost always, that narrative is distorted. It magnifies the danger. It minimizes your resources. It pulls in every past failure that feels remotely similar and uses them as evidence that this situation will end the same way. It whispers things like, "This is too much. You cannot handle this. This is going to destroy everything." And because the brain under stress craves certainty, it accepts these distortions as truth rather than questioning them. The story your mind tells about a difficult situation determines how you experience that situation far more than the situation itself. Two people can face the exact same crisis and have completely different internal experiences. Not because of what happened, but because of what each person's mind constructed around what happened. One person tells a story of overwhelm and collapse. The other tells a story of challenge and navigation. The external circumstances are identical. The internal realities are worlds apart. This is why understanding the war inside your mind is not abstract or theoretical. It is profoundly practical, because once you understand that your breakdown under pressure is the result of a biological hijacking combined with a distorted narrative, you realize that both of those things can be addressed. The amygdala response can be regulated through specific trainable techniques. The story can be examined, questioned, and rewritten. You are not at the mercy of your own nervous system. You are its commander in training. And the training starts with seeing exactly what happens in precise detail every time the pressure arrives and you feel yourself beginning to crack. The most important skill you can develop at this stage is what might be called the observer's stance. This is the ability to watch your own internal experience with a degree of separation, to notice that you are spiraling without becoming fully consumed by the spiral. To think thoughts like, "My amygdala is activated right now," rather than "the world is ending." To watch the catastrophic story forming and ask, "Is this actually true, or is this my stressed brain trying to make sense of uncertainty?" This small shift in perspective from being inside the reaction to observing it changes everything. It creates a sliver of space between the trigger and your response. And in that space lives every ounce of your power. Chapter 3. The Anatomy of Pressure. What it does to you and how to use it instead. Pressure is everywhere. It is in the moment before a difficult conversation begins. It is in the silence after receiving news that changes everything. It is in the long sleepless nights when you do not know how something is going to work out. It is in the gap between where you are and where you desperately need to be. Pressure is one of the most consistent features of a human life. Nobody gets to avoid it. The only variable is what you do with it when it arrives. Most people have a fundamentally adversarial relationship with pressure. They experience it as an enemy, something to be escaped, avoided, survived. They white-knuckle their way through high-pressure situations, desperate to get to the other side, counting the minutes until it passes. And because of this relationship, pressure always wins. Not because pressure is stronger, but because they are spending all of their energy fighting it. Rather than understanding it and working with it, here is the truth that the mentally strongest people in the world understand. Pressure is not just a threat to be managed. It is also a resource to be used. Not always. Not in its most extreme forms. But in the vast majority of situations that people experience as high pressure, there is energy available inside that pressure. Physiological activation, heightened focus, a sharpening of attention that when directed correctly actually improves performance rather than destroying it. The problem is that most people's nervous systems have never been taught the difference between pressure that is useful and pressure that is overwhelming. So the body escalates everything to the same level of emergency, which wastes the energy and triggers the breakdown. Understanding the anatomy of pressure means learning to read what is happening inside you with precision. Not all pressure feels the same. There is the pressure that sharpens you. The kind that comes before something important that makes your senses more alert and your mind more focused. Athletes know this feeling. Performers know it. People who have learned to do hard things repeatedly know it. This kind of pressure, when you understand it for what it is, becomes fuel. Then there is the pressure that scatters you. The kind that arrives with no clear outlet, that builds and builds with nowhere to go, that accumulates from weeks or months of unresolved stress until the body is in a permanent state of low-grade emergency. This kind of pressure is damaging and it needs to be understood and addressed differently. The body's pressure response is not random. It follows a pattern, and once you learn to recognize that pattern in yourself, you gain a significant amount of control over it. The early signs are always subtle. A slight tightening in the shoulders, a change in breathing, shallower, faster, higher in the chest, a narrowing of attention where the problem becomes the only thing you can see. These early signals are your body giving you a warning. And if you catch them here, you have the most leverage. You can intervene before the cascade takes over. You can choose your response before the response chooses you. One of the most important things to understand about pressure is the role that your interpretation of it plays in what it does to you. Research in psychology has consistently shown that people who interpret their physiological arousal under pressure as excitement rather than anxiety perform significantly better than those who interpret the same arousal as a sign that something is wrong. Your heart is pounding. Your palms are damp. Your mind is racing. These are neutral physiological facts. The story you attach to them determines whether they help you or hurt you. Telling yourself, "I am excited about this challenge," produces a completely different internal state than telling yourself, "I cannot handle this." Even though the body's signals are identical, you have more authorship over your experience of pressure than you have ever been taught to believe. There is also a dimension of pressure that almost nobody talks about. And it is the pressure that comes from within rather than from without. Most people think of pressure as something that happens to them, an external demand, a deadline, a crisis, a conflict. But a significant portion of the pressure most people carry is self-generated. It is the pressure of a ruthlessly self-critical inner voice that turns every imperfection into evidence of failure. The pressure of impossible standards that were never designed to be met. The pressure of comparison, measuring your internal experience against other people's external presentation and finding yourself perpetually lacking. This internal pressure is in many ways more damaging than any external source because it never stops. There is no end to the workday. There is no moment when the critical voice decides you have suffered enough and lets you rest. Learning to recognize self-generated pressure and address it directly is one of the most transformative things you can do for your mental strength. Not by lowering your standards, not by abandoning the drive toward excellence, but by learning to separate the healthy pursuit of growth from the toxic habit of self-destruction. You can care deeply about doing well without treating every stumble as proof of fundamental unworthiness. You can hold yourself to a high standard without making your sense of value conditional on flawless performance. That distinction is not a small one. It is the difference between pressure that builds you and pressure that dismantles you from the inside. Chapter 4. Rewiring your inner world. Breaking the mental patterns that keep you fragile. Your mind is not a fixed thing. This is one of the most important discoveries in modern neuroscience and one of the most empowering facts about being human. For a long time, it was believed that the brain you had in adulthood was essentially the brain you were stuck with. That the patterns, the tendencies, the automatic responses were wired in permanently. A product of genetics and early experience that could not be meaningfully changed. That belief was wrong. The brain is plastic. It reshapes itself in response to experience, to practice, to repetition, and to the choices you make about where to direct your attention. And this means that no matter how long you have been running patterns of fragility, of anxiety, of catastrophic thinking, of emotional collapse under pressure, you can change them. Not easily, not overnight, but genuinely, deeply, durably. The first step in rewiring your inner world is understanding how mental patterns form in the first place. The brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. Its primary goal is efficiency. It wants to make the future as predictable and navigable as possible using the least amount of energy. So every time you respond to a situation in a particular way, the brain notes the pattern. Every time that same response is repeated, the neural pathway associated with it becomes slightly stronger. Over time, what began as a choice becomes a habit. And what began as a habit becomes something that feels like an unchangeable part of who you are. The person who always panics in confrontation did not start out that way. They simply panicked in confrontation enough times that the brain began predicting that confrontation would lead to panic and then doing everything in its power to fulfill that prediction. This is actually good news because if patterns are formed through repetition, they can also be reformed through repetition. The process of building a new mental pattern is not complicated in principle, though it requires significant commitment in practice. It works like this. You identify the old pattern clearly. Not just the behavior but the thought that precedes it, the emotion that accompanies it, the physical sensation that signals it is coming. Then you create a deliberate interruption in that pattern, a pause, a breath, a moment of conscious choice where the automatic response would otherwise take over. And into that pause, you introduce a different response. Not a forced positive one, not a performance of calm you do not feel, but a more accurate, more grounded, more useful response, one that is still honest about the difficulty, but refuses to be catastrophic about it. The most common mental patterns that keep people fragile are ones most people have never named or examined directly. The first is catastrophizing, the habit of automatically jumping to the worst possible interpretation of any ambiguous situation. A friend does not reply to a message and the mind immediately generates scenarios of conflict, abandonment, disaster. A symptom appears and the mind goes straight to terminal illness. A business stumbles and the mind decides it is permanent and total failure. Catastrophizing is not stupidity. It is the brain running its threat detection system on overdrive, trying to protect you by preparing you for the worst. But it generates enormous disproportionate suffering for situations that are either not as serious as they seem or that have not even happened yet. The second pattern is black and white thinking. The tendency to see every situation as either perfect or ruined. Every person is either completely trustworthy or completely dangerous. Every outcome is either full success or total failure. Life, of course, exists almost entirely in the nuanced middle. But the brain under stress collapses that complexity into either or choices because nuance requires cognitive effort and stress reduces the brain's capacity for that effort. The cost of black and white thinking is enormous. It eliminates partial wins. It makes recovery from mistakes feel impossible because any imperfection is coded as complete failure. It destroys relationships by refusing to hold the complexity of people who are both flawed and worthy of love simultaneously. The third pattern is mind reading, the assumption that you know what other people are thinking and that what they are thinking is negative. Someone seems distracted in conversation and you decide they are bored with you. Someone's tone seems slightly different and you immediately interpret it as disapproval or contempt. This pattern keeps people in a constant state of social anxiety, interpreting neutral cues as rejection and building elaborate internal stories about what others think and feel without ever checking whether any of it is true. Dismantling these patterns requires something that most people find profoundly uncomfortable at first. The practice of examining your own thoughts with critical attention. Not to be harsh on yourself. Not to spend hours in self-analysis, but to develop the habit of asking one simple question when a thought arrives that generates anxiety or despair. Is this actually true? Or is this a mental pattern running on autopilot? That question alone, asked consistently with genuine curiosity, begins to dissolve the automatic authority that distorted thinking holds over your emotional experience. You are not fighting your thoughts. You are simply choosing to no longer accept them uncritically as reality. As you build this practice, something remarkable begins to happen. The old patterns do not disappear immediately, but they lose their grip. They start to feel like weather, something you can observe passing through without being swept away by it, and new patterns, ones built on accuracy and groundedness rather than distortion and fear, begin to take their place. This rewiring is not theoretical. It is neurological. Every time you interrupt a catastrophic thought and replace it with something more grounded, you weaken the neural pathway of catastrophizing and strengthen the pathway of perspective. Repeated enough times, what was once effortful becomes automatic. The brain that once defaulted to panic begins defaulting to clarity. The mind that once broke down begins holding firm. This is the architecture of unbreakable mental strength being laid down one conscious choice at a time. Chapter 5. The Stillness Beneath the Storm. Learning to regulate your emotions without suppressing them. There is a stillness available to you that has nothing to do with the absence of difficulty. It is not a stillness that requires life to cooperate, that depends on things going smoothly, that only shows up when nothing is wrong. It is a stillness that exists beneath everything, beneath the noise of circumstances, beneath the fluctuations of emotion, beneath the constant movement of thought. It is the stillness of a mind that has learned to be present with its own experience without being destroyed by it. And developing access to that stillness is one of the most transformative and most practical things you will ever do. Let us be clear about what emotional regulation is and what it is not, because this is one of the areas where people most commonly go wrong. Emotional regulation is not the suppression of emotion. Suppression, pushing feelings down, refusing to acknowledge them. Building a wall between yourself and your inner experience is not regulation. It is avoidance. And avoidance has a cost. Emotions that are suppressed do not disappear. They migrate. They show up in physical tension, in sudden eruptions of disproportionate anger, in the low-grade chronic anxiety that sits just beneath the surface of daily life. They manifest in patterns of behavior you do not understand because the emotional root of those patterns has never been allowed into consciousness. Suppression is borrowing against tomorrow's peace to survive today. And the debt always comes due. Real emotional regulation begins with something much more courageous than suppression. It begins with turning toward the emotion, looking at it clearly, naming it precisely, not good or bad, not comfortable or uncomfortable, but specific. This is grief. This is fear. This is shame. This is anger. There is remarkable power in the act of naming an emotion accurately. Brain imaging research has shown that the simple act of labeling an emotion reduces its intensity because it shifts activity from the reactive amygdala toward the more regulated prefrontal cortex. Language creates distance. Distance creates space. Space creates the possibility of choice. When you name what you are feeling without immediately trying to change it or escape it, something loosens. The emotion no longer has to compete for your attention. It has been acknowledged, and acknowledged things do not need to scream. The second element of genuine emotional regulation is what might be called anchored presence. This is the skill of returning your nervous system to a state of physiological stability even while difficult things are happening. The most direct pathway to that stability runs through the body, and specifically through the breath. This is not a metaphor. When you are in a state of high emotional activation, your breathing becomes shallow, fast, and high in the chest. A pattern that feeds the stress response and keeps the nervous system escalated. When you deliberately slow and deepen your breathing, drawing air into the belly, making the exhale longer than the inhale, you directly activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for rest, recovery, and rational thought. You are not thinking your way to calm. You are physiologically creating the conditions in which calm becomes possible. This is why breath is the foundation of every serious tradition of mental and emotional training in human history. Not because it is simple or because it sounds good in a self-help context, but because it actually works at the level of biology. A person who has trained their ability to return to slow, deep breathing in moments of high stress has an advantage that cannot be overstated. They can access their best thinking when others are losing theirs. They can choose their response when others are reacting blindly. They can remain present to what is actually happening rather than being consumed by what their nervous system is predicting will happen. This is not magic. It is a trainable physiological skill. But emotional regulation goes deeper than breath work. It also requires you to develop a fundamentally different relationship with discomfort itself. Most people operate with an implicit belief that emotional discomfort is dangerous, that anxiety must be stopped immediately, that sadness is a problem to be solved, that anger is shameful and must be contained before anyone can see it. This belief is one of the primary drivers of mental fragility because it makes every difficult emotion a crisis rather than a passing experience. When you believe that your discomfort is dangerous, you will do almost anything to avoid it. You will numb. You will distract. You will lash out. You will retreat. And in doing all of those things, you never actually discover the truth, that you can feel enormous discomfort and survive it. That emotions, even the most intense ones, are temporary. That the wave rises, peaks, and passes if you let it. Learning to tolerate discomfort without fleeing from it is perhaps the single most important skill in the entire domain of emotional regulation. Not to enjoy the discomfort, not to be indifferent to it, but to develop enough of a relationship with your own capacity to endure it that it stops being a source of terror. Each time you allow yourself to feel something difficult, to sit with anxiety instead of immediately reaching for distraction, to grieve instead of immediately covering the grief with activity, to feel the heat of anger without immediately acting on it, you prove something to yourself. You prove that you are bigger than the feeling, that the feeling cannot break you. And with every repetition of that proof, your tolerance expands, your regulation improves, and the stillness beneath the storm becomes less something you hope for and more something you can actually find reliably, even in the hardest moments of your life. The third element of deep emotional regulation is perspective. The trained ability to zoom out from the intensity of the present moment and place it within a larger context. When you are inside a difficult emotion, the present moment feels like everything. It feels permanent. It feels defining. The pain of right now projects itself onto every tomorrow and makes the future look exactly like how right now feels. This is one of the most disorienting things about intense emotion, and it is also one of the most important things to interrupt because the present moment is not everything. It is not permanent, and it is almost never as defining as it feels while you are inside it. Ask yourself honestly, How many situations in your past felt absolutely catastrophic in the moment and now occupy barely a footnote in your memory? How many things you were certain would break you did not break you? How many storms you were convinced you could not survive, you walked out of changed but intact? You have more evidence than you realize that you are capable of handling difficulty. You have already handled it many times. The mistake is that when the next crisis arrives, you forget everything you survived before. Perspective is the practice of deliberately remembering, of reaching back into your own history, and using what is actually true, that you are still here, that you have endured before, that this too will pass, to counterbalance the distortion of an overwhelmed present moment. It does not remove the pain, but it changes your relationship to it in a way that makes bearing it not only possible, but the beginning of something new. Chapter 6. The Discipline of Calm. How to train your nervous system to choose steadiness. Calm is not a personality trait. It is not something that certain lucky people were born with while others were left to manage without it. Calm is a discipline. It is a practiced, trained, deliberately developed capacity that is available to anyone willing to do the work of building it. And like every other form of discipline, it does not arrive through wishing or through good intentions. It arrives through repetition, through structure, and through the willingness to show up for the practice, even especially when it feels uncomfortable to do so. Most people treat calm as something that happens to them when circumstances happen to cooperate. When the day goes smoothly, they feel calm. When it does not, they do not. Their internal state is essentially a mirror of whatever is happening around them. This is the default setting of an untrained mind. And it is an extraordinarily fragile way to live, because circumstances will always be unreliable. Life will always contain days that do not cooperate. If your calm depends on the world behaving itself, then you will spend most of your life in a state of reactive agitation, lurching from one destabilizing situation to the next, forever at the mercy of things you cannot control. The discipline of calm works differently. It does not wait for circumstances to become favorable before settling into steadiness. It creates steadiness as a baseline state, a default that the body and mind return to, not because everything is fine, but because they have been trained to do so. This is the difference between reactive calm and cultivated calm. Reactive calm is fragile and circumstantial. Cultivated calm is durable and internal. And the way you cultivate it is through what might be called a daily nervous system practice. Your nervous system has two primary operating modes, and understanding them is essential. The first is the sympathetic mode, the fight or flight state that activates under threat, real or perceived. In this mode, you are alert, reactive, and primed for immediate action. Heart rate is elevated, muscles are tense, thinking is fast but narrow. This mode is essential for genuine emergencies. The problem is that modern life keeps most people in a low-level version of this state almost constantly. The constant stimulation of screens, the relentless pressure of notifications, the ambient noise of news and deadlines, and social comparison keeps the sympathetic nervous system on a slow simmer from morning to night. Over time, this becomes the body's new normal. And a body that has normalized low-grade stress has almost no buffer left. When something truly difficult arrives, the second mode is the parasympathetic mode. The rest and digest state that activates during safety, recovery, and genuine rest. In this mode, heart rate slows, muscles release their tension, blood flow returns to the prefrontal cortex, restoring access to clear thinking, creativity, and perspective. This is the physiological state of calm, and the body can be trained to shift into it more readily, more reliably, and more completely than most people ever realize. The daily nervous system practice is not complicated, but it must be consistent. It begins every morning before the day's demands arrive. Before the phone, before the news, before the inbox, a period of deliberate slowness, breath that is long and deep, movement that is gentle and intentional, or simply stillness that is chosen rather than forced upon you by exhaustion. What you are doing in these moments is not simply relaxing. You are setting a baseline. You are telling your nervous system that today's steadiness is the starting point. That activation will come because it always does. But it will be returning to something rather than escalating from nothing throughout the day. The discipline of calm expresses itself in micro practices. The single deep breath before responding to something that triggered you. The deliberate pause before sending the message written in frustration. The moment of conscious grounding, feet on the floor. Attention in the body rather than in the spiral of thought when you feel the first signs of overwhelm beginning. These are not grand gestures. They are tiny, frequent acts of self-command, and their cumulative effect practiced daily across weeks and months is the gradual recalibration of your entire nervous system toward a steadier default. The person who does this for 6 months does not recognize the version of themselves from before. Not because their problems have changed, but because their baseline has. They are no longer starting each day already half-triggered. They are starting from ground, and from ground everything becomes more manageable. There is also a physical dimension to the discipline of calm that deserves direct attention because the body and the mind are not separate systems communicating through glass. They are one integrated system, and what you do with the body has immediate and measurable consequences for the mind. Sleep is the foundation that everything else rests on. A mind operating on chronic sleep deprivation has a dramatically compromised capacity for emotional regulation. The amygdala becomes hypersensitive. The prefrontal cortex loses its moderating influence. Things that would be manageable under full rest become disproportionately upsetting. There is no mental strength practice powerful enough to fully compensate for a nervous system that is never allowed to genuinely recover. Sleep is not optional equipment. It is the infrastructure on which every other capacity is built. Movement is the second physical pillar of calm. Not necessarily intense training, though that has its place. But regular, consistent movement of the body, walking, stretching, anything that gets you out of your head and into your physical experience is one of the most effective nervous system regulation tools available. It burns off accumulated stress hormones. It releases endorphins that shift your neurochemical baseline towards stability. It interrupts the ruminative thought loops that keep the sympathetic nervous system activated long after the original stressor has passed. A person who moves their body every day is a calmer person, not as a side effect, but as a direct biological consequence. The discipline of calm is ultimately the discipline of treating your own nervous system with the same intentionality and care you would give to anything else you want to perform well. You would not expect a high-performance instrument to function optimally under conditions of constant misuse and neglect. Your nervous system is no different. Train it deliberately. Protect it consistently. Return to it regularly throughout the day. And over time, the calm you once experienced only on lucky days will become the state you inhabit as a matter of practice, a steadiness that belongs to you, not to your circumstances. Chapter 7. Fear is a compass. How to stop running from the thing that is trying to guide you. Fear has been misunderstood. For as long as human beings have been afraid, which is to say, forever. From the time you were small enough to be told to be brave, fear was framed as the opposite of strength. Something to overcome, defeat, push past. Something that the capable and the courageous somehow manage to not feel or feel less of. This framing has done an extraordinary amount of damage because fear is not weakness. Fear is not the enemy. Fear is, when you learn to read it correctly, one of the most reliable compasses you will ever have access to. And the people who have built truly unbreakable mental strength are not the people who have conquered fear. They are the people who have learned to have a different relationship with it entirely. Start with what fear actually is. Biologically, fear is a signal. It is your nervous system's way of flagging something it has identified as significant, as something that matters enough to require your full attention and careful navigation. Fear evolved as a survival mechanism. And in that original context, it was enormously useful. The physical fear response, the flood of adrenaline, the heightening of the senses, the mobilization of energy was designed to help you respond to genuine immediate physical danger with speed and force. In that context, fear was not an obstacle. It was an asset. The complications arise because the same biological system that responds to physical danger also responds to psychological threat. The fear of rejection, the fear of failure, the fear of being seen as inadequate, the fear of loss, of change, of the unknown. These are not the same as a predator in the dark, but the nervous system responds to them with many of the same mechanisms. And because these psychological fears are far more frequent in modern life than physical ones, most people experience the fear response as a near constant companion. One that seems to be blocking them at every important juncture rather than helping them navigate anything. Here is the insight that changes everything. In the domain of human growth and achievement, fear almost always points directly at what matters most. When you feel fear in the direction of something, a difficult conversation you have been avoiding, a creative project you have been too frightened to start, a relationship that would require real vulnerability, a career move that would mean genuine risk, that fear is not telling you that the thing is wrong for you. It is telling you that the thing is significant, that it matters, that the outcome would have real weight. Fear is not repulsion. Fear is gravity. It is the feeling of being drawn towards something that has enough importance to register as a threat if it goes wrong. This reframe is not merely philosophical. It has immediate practical consequences. When you begin to interpret fear not as a stop sign, but as a compass needle pointing toward what matters, your entire relationship with difficult action changes. You stop waiting to feel fearless before you move. You stop interpreting the presence of fear as evidence that you should retreat. Instead, you begin to ask, what is this fear pointing at? What does the presence of this fear tell me about what I value, about what I want, about what would be meaningful to pursue? And then you move toward it anyway. Not recklessly, not without preparation, but with the understanding that the fear will be present for the journey whether you go or stay, and that staying carries its own costs. The quiet corrosive cost of a life lived smaller than it could have been. The relationship between fear and action is not the one most people imagine. Most people believe that courage is the absence of fear, that the brave person feels nothing while the coward feels everything. This is not what courage is. Courage is the decision to move towards something important in the full presence of fear. Not despite the fear exactly, but alongside it, acknowledging it, understanding it, even respecting it as a signal that you are heading somewhere that matters and going anyway. This is a skill that is built through deliberate practice, not through the one grand act of heroism that motivation culture tends to celebrate. The practice of building courage is incremental and cumulative. It works the same way as physical training. You begin with weights you can lift, not the maximum you might eventually manage. You start by moving towards small fears deliberately. Not the fear of public humiliation or catastrophic loss, but the everyday fears that quietly run your decisions. The fear of the difficult conversation. The fear of raising your hand in the meeting. The fear of sending the creative work to someone whose opinion matters to you. Each time you move toward one of these smaller fears, and discover that the consequence is survivable, that you did not break, that the world did not end, that you in fact feel more alive and more capable on the other side. You are building the evidence base that makes the next courageous act slightly easier. Courage compounds. Every small act of moving toward fear rather than away from it strengthens the neural pathway of forward motion and weakens the pathway of retreat. Over time, what once felt like an enormous act of bravery becomes simply the way you operate. There is one more dimension of fear that is essential to understand. And it is the fear that lives inside you disguised as something else entirely. Procrastination in most cases is fear wearing the mask of laziness. Perfectionism is fear wearing the mask of high standards. Constant busyness is fear wearing the mask of productivity. These are the sophisticated disguises that fear adopts when you are smart enough not to consciously admit that you are afraid. And they are extraordinarily effective at keeping people stuck. Because when the underlying fear is never named, it can never be addressed. The solution to procrastination is not more time management. It is the honest question. What am I afraid of here? What outcome am I avoiding by staying in preparation rather than moving into action? Name the fear. Look at it directly and then choose whether you are going to let it make your decisions or whether you are going to make them yourself. There is a final truth about fear that the mentally strong have accepted and the mentally fragile have not. And it is simply this: the fear never fully goes away. This is not a discouraging fact. It is a freeing one because it means you can stop waiting for the day when you will no longer feel afraid before you begin to act. The accomplished, the resilient, the genuinely strong are not people who have arrived at a place beyond fear. They are people who have normalized, moving in its presence, who have so thoroughly practiced the act of going forward while afraid that fear has become a familiar companion rather than a paralyzing obstacle. They still feel it. They still notice the quickened pulse and the tightening chest and the voice that says, "What if this goes wrong?" They simply no longer grant that voice veto power over their choices. And in that refusal to grant veto power lies the entire architecture of a courageous life. Chapter 8. The Gift of Adversity. Why hardship is the only true school of mental strength. There is something that the mentally strong know that the merely comfortable do not. It is a knowledge that cannot be read into existence or reasoned into being. It can only be earned. And it is this hardship, when met with the right internal orientation, does not diminish you. It builds you in ways that nothing else can. It develops capacities that no amount of ease, no level of comfort, no stretch of untroubled days will ever produce. The person who has been through genuinely difficult things and come out the other side is different in kind from the person who has not. Not better as a human being, but more capable as one. More developed in the specific competencies that allow a person to navigate a life that will, without question, contain more difficulty ahead. This is not a call to romanticize suffering. Hardship is real. Loss is real. There is nothing noble about pain for its own sake. Nothing to be celebrated in struggle that produces only damage. The point is not that suffering is good. The point is that suffering, when it arrives, and it will arrive for all of us in forms we did not choose and did not invite, can be met with an orientation that transforms it from pure damage into something that strengthens. And that orientation is itself a learnable skill, one of the most important you will ever develop. Post-traumatic growth is not a metaphor or a motivational concept. It is a documented psychological phenomenon. Research consistently shows that a significant proportion of people who navigate serious adversity, illness, loss, financial devastation, the end of important relationships, profound failure report not just recovery, but genuine growth in the aftermath. They describe an expanded sense of what they are capable of, a deepened appreciation for what matters, a clarity about their values that the comfortable life had never produced, a quality of compassion for others who struggle that can only come from having genuinely struggled yourself. These are not consolation prizes. They are real and lasting changes to the architecture of a person's inner life, and they are available to you in the difficulty you are facing or have already faced if you are willing to meet it with the right internal stance. The first element of that stance is what might be called deliberate meaning-making. Human beings are meaning-making creatures by nature. We cannot help but construct narratives around what happens to us. The question is not whether you will make meaning out of your difficulties. The question is what kind of meaning you will make. The person who meets adversity with the narrative "this is happening to destroy me" will have a fundamentally different experience of an outcome from the same adversity than the person who meets it with "this is happening and I will find what it has to teach me." The external circumstances are identical. The internal architecture is worlds apart. And over time, the internal architecture determines everything. The speed of recovery, the depth of growth, the quality of the life that follows. Deliberate meaning-making does not require you to be grateful for your pain or to pretend that difficulty is not difficult. It requires only that you refuse to let the experience be entirely without purpose, that you ask even in the depths of it, "What is this developing in me? What capacity am I building right now that I would not be building if this were not happening? What is becoming clear to me through this that was invisible before?" These questions do not remove the pain, but they direct your attention towards something constructive within it. And that direction makes an enormous difference to how the experience processes through you and what it leaves behind. The second element is the active cultivation of endurance. The practiced willingness to stay present to difficulty without prematurely collapsing it into meaning or rushing past it toward resolution. There is a temptation in hard times to either deny what is happening or to fix it so quickly that the deeper lessons it carries never have time to register. Both tendencies shortcut the very process through which growth occurs. Real endurance is not white-knuckling through something with clenched teeth and a resolved jaw. It is the quieter and more demanding practice of remaining open to the experience while it is happening, allowing it to move through you, being changed by it rather than merely surviving it. This kind of endurance is built in the same way that physical endurance is built through progressive exposure to increasingly demanding conditions with adequate recovery in between. Every time you stay present to something difficult rather than numbing or distracting or collapsing, you are extending your capacity for endurance. Every time you face uncertainty without demanding immediate resolution, you are building tolerance for the discomfort of not knowing that is essential for navigating complex, unpredictable circumstances. Every time you experience a setback and choose to stay in the game rather than withdraw, you are training the part of you that does not quit, the part that will serve you when the stakes are highest. The third element is community. The understanding that adversity is not meant to be endured entirely alone and that seeking support is not weakness but wisdom. The most resilient people in the world are not the most isolated. They are the most connected. They have relationships in which difficulty can be named without judgment, in which vulnerability is met with presence rather than advice, in which the burden of hard experience is shared rather than carried alone. The architecture of resilience is partly internal and partly relational. Build both. What the school of adversity ultimately teaches, if you are willing to be its student, is a knowledge of yourself that no comfortable life could provide. You learn what you are actually made of when the pretenses fall away. You learn which of your values are genuine and which are merely convenient. You learn who shows up for you and who disappears. You learn that you are more capable than you believed and more resilient than you feared. And you learn, perhaps most importantly, that difficulty does not last forever. That there is always eventually a way through, and that making it through is not the end of the story but the beginning of a stronger, clearer, more fully realized one. Chapter 9. The focused mind. Protecting your attention is the foundation of mental strength. Everything you are building in this audiobook depends on one thing more than any other. Not willpower, not motivation, not talent or intelligence or ambition. It depends on your ability to control where your attention goes. Because your attention is not simply a sensory tool for taking in information. Your attention is the creative force of your life. Where you place it consistently over time determines what you think about, how you feel, what you believe is possible, what actions you take, and ultimately who you become. A person whose attention is scattered, reactive, and constantly captured by whatever is loudest in the environment is a person who is being lived by their life rather than living it. A person whose attention is trained, directed, and protected is a person with real power over their own experience and their own trajectory. We are living through a period of unprecedented assault on human attention. This is not hyperbole. The technology that surrounds you, the platforms, the feeds, the notifications, the algorithms was designed by extraordinarily intelligent people with access to vast amounts of behavioral data to capture and hold your attention as effectively as possible. Not for your benefit, for theirs. The business model of the modern attention economy depends on your inability to look away. And every feature, every notification, every infinitely scrolling feed was engineered with that goal in mind. Understanding this is not paranoia. It is orientation. It tells you what you are actually dealing with when you try to focus and find it nearly impossible. You are not lazy. You are not weak-willed. You are a human nervous system operating in an environment that was purpose-built to overwhelm it. The result of living inside this environment without deliberate resistance is a mind that has been gradually reconditioned to operate in a state of fragmented, shallow, reactive attention. A mind that has difficulty sustaining focus on a single thing for more than a few minutes before scanning for novelty. A mind that has come to associate stillness with discomfort, depth with boredom, and silence with something that needs to be immediately filled. This is not a character flaw. It is the predictable outcome of a particular set of inputs applied over a long enough period of time. And just as it was shaped by repetition, it can be reshaped by repetition through the deliberate practice of directing and protecting your attention with the same intentionality you would give to any other serious training. The first discipline of the focused mind is the practice of single tasking. This runs counter to everything that modern productivity culture has told you. But the research is unambiguous. Human beings do not actually multitask. What they do is task switch rapidly and repeatedly at significant cognitive cost. Every switch between tasks requires the brain to disengage from one context and engage with another. A process that takes time, burns mental energy and leaves a residue of the previous task interfering with focus on the current one. The person who works on 3 things simultaneously is not doing 3 things well. They are doing 3 things poorly at a cost that adds up across the entire day. The antidote is radical in its simplicity. Do one thing at a time. Give it your complete attention, finish it or reach a natural pause point before moving to the next. This sounds obvious in practice in the environment most people inhabit. It is profoundly countercultural and enormously powerful. The second discipline is the protection of your deep work time. There is a category of cognitive activity, call it deep work, that requires sustained uninterrupted focus over an extended period. Writing that demands real thought. Problem solving that requires holding multiple complex variables simultaneously. Creative work. Strategic thinking. Learning that goes beyond surface-level familiarity to genuine understanding. This kind of work is where the most important things get done. It is also the kind of work that is most vulnerable to interruption, because even a brief disruption, a notification glanced at, a question answered, an email checked can break the depth of concentration required and take 20 or more minutes to re-establish. If you do not actively protect time for deep work, it will not happen. The day will fill with shallow reactive tasks and the most important things will remain perpetually undone. Protecting deep work time requires environmental design. The phone out of reach, not merely silenced. The notification systems disabled, not just minimized. A physical or temporal space that signals to your own brain and to those around you that you are unavailable for the duration. None of this requires expensive tools or elaborate systems. It requires only the decision that the quality of your attention is worth protecting and the willingness to structure your environment accordingly. The third discipline is the practice of boredom tolerance. This may sound trivial, but it is not. The discomfort of boredom, the feeling of having nothing to immediately stimulate you, has become, for most people, something to be instantly relieved through reaching for a screen. The consequence of this pattern is a progressive decrease in the mind's ability to generate its own engagement, its own curiosity, its own creative connection making. A mind that is never allowed to be unstimulated is a mind that gradually loses the ability to think deeply, to imagine freely, to access the kind of slow wandering attention that has historically been the source of creative insight and genuine self-knowledge. Deliberately tolerating boredom, sitting with it, allowing it to pass through you without immediately medicating it, is one of the most effective ways to restore and deepen the quality of your attention. It trains the brain to find its own resources, to generate its own material, to be genuinely present rather than constantly consuming. The focused mind is in the end the foundation of mental strength because it is the prerequisite of everything else. You cannot regulate your emotions if your attention is too scattered to notice what you are feeling before it has already taken over. You cannot challenge distorted thinking patterns if your mind never slows down enough to examine them. You cannot make deliberate choices about how to respond to pressure if your attention is always captured before you have a chance to choose. The work of training your attention is not separate from the work of building mental strength. It is the ground on which all of that work stands. Chapter 10. The Identity Shift. Becoming someone who does not break. Everything you have learned so far in this audiobook. The understanding of how your brain responds to stress, the tools for regulating emotion, the practices for building calm and resilience, the cultivation of focused attention, all of it is powerful. All of it works. But there is a level beneath all of these practices that is more foundational than any of them. And if you do not address it, you will find that the practices you apply remain fragile, inconsistent, easily abandoned when life becomes genuinely difficult. That level is identity, not what you do, but who you believe yourself to be. Because ultimately people do not rise to the level of their goals. They fall to the level of their identity. And if your deepest self-conception does not include the belief that you are someone who holds firm, no strategy will hold you there for long. Identity is not a fixed thing handed to you at birth or solidified in childhood and then simply lived out. Identity is constructed continuously through the accumulation of evidence you gather about yourself over time. Every action you take is a vote cast for a particular kind of person. Every choice you make in a difficult moment is a data point that your mind files under "this is who I am." This process happens largely beneath conscious awareness, which means that most people's identities are being constructed by default, by habits they have not examined, by stories they have absorbed from others, by the accumulated evidence of what they have done under pressure rather than what they were capable of doing. This default construction often tells a story of limitation. A story built from the times they avoided difficulty, the times they gave up, the times fear won, and the better choice was left unmade. The intentional construction of identity works differently. It begins with a decision. Not a feeling, not a mood, not a moment of inspiration, but a deliberate choice about who you are going to become and what evidence you are going to start deliberately generating. It works like this. You choose the identity first. Not based on what you have already proven you can do, but based on what you decide you are becoming. I am someone who faces difficulty without running. I am someone who regulates their emotions before they speak. I am someone who does not quit when things become hard. I am someone who can be trusted to remain steady when everything around me is not. These are not affirmations in the empty wishful sense. They are identity declarations, commitments that then guide the specific actions you take. Because now those actions are not just strategies you are applying, but expressions of who you are. The most powerful thing you can do in the early stages of an identity shift is to find the smallest, most immediate actions that are consistent with the new identity and begin taking them with absolute reliability. Not the grand gestures, not the extraordinary feats of courage and resilience that you imagine strong people performing. The small consistent daily acts that somebody with your chosen identity would take as a matter of course. The person who is building the identity of someone who remains calm takes one slow breath before responding to every frustrating situation. Every time, not sometimes, every time. The person building the identity of someone who faces difficulty rather than avoiding it makes one uncomfortable phone call or has one conversation they have been putting off every week without negotiation because these are not acts of discipline requiring enormous effort. They are simply things that this kind of person does. And every time you do them, the identity solidifies a little more. The evidence accumulates. The story your mind tells about you shifts. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called the narrative self. The ongoing story you tell about who you are, where you came from, and where you are headed. This narrative is not merely a description. It is a prescription. It shapes your expectations about what is possible for you. And those expectations shape your behavior in ways that tend to make them self-fulfilling. A person whose narrative centers on fragility will find evidence of fragility everywhere. A person whose narrative centers on growing strength will find evidence of that, too. The narrative is not neutral. It is generative, and you have more authority over it than you have been taught to believe. Part of the identity shift is the deliberate revision of your narrative. Not the invention of a false history, not the pretense that you have never struggled or failed or collapsed under pressure, but the reinterpretation of your history through a more accurate and more empowering lens. Because the story you tell about your past is not simply a recounting of what happened. It is a selection and interpretation of what happened and the events of your life viewed from the right angle. Tell a story not of someone broken but of someone who has been in genuine difficulty and who is still here, still going, still choosing to grow. That is not a small story. That is the story of a person of substance, and it is your story if you choose to tell it that way. The identity of someone who does not break is not built in a moment of inspiration. It is built in the ordinary moments. The moments when you are tired and you do the thing anyway. The moments when you are frustrated and you choose your response instead of reacting. The moments when quitting would be easy and you stay. These moments do not feel heroic from the inside. They feel small. They feel like just getting through. But they are not small. They are the brick and mortar of a self that holds. They are the slow, unglamorous, entirely real construction of a person who, when the genuinely hard thing comes, and it will come, has something to stand on. An identity so thoroughly built through consistent action that it does not even occur to them to collapse, because collapse simply is not what this kind of person does, and by that point that kind of person is you. The shift in identity is not the end of the journey. It is the point at which the journey changes character. Before the shift, building mental strength feels like an external discipline being applied to a resistant self. Something you are doing to yourself from the outside in. After the shift, it becomes something different. It becomes the natural expression of who you are. The practices no longer require force. The choices no longer require negotiation. The difficult things no longer feel like tests of willpower but like ordinary demonstrations of character. This is the state that the mentally strongest people inhabit. Not because life has become easy for them. Not because they have somehow escaped the conditions that challenge everyone else, but because who they believe themselves to be has aligned with how they actually live. And when belief and action align at the level of identity, there is almost nothing that can break you. Chapter 11. The Strength in Stillness. Why silence and solitude are not empty but essential. There is something that the modern world is deeply uncomfortable with. Something it has built an entire infrastructure of noise and stimulation to help you avoid. And it is the experience of being completely alone with yourself in silence. Not bored, not idle, not disconnected in the passive, numbed out way that comes from exhaustion, but genuinely, deliberately, attentively present with your own inner experience. Without distraction, without input, without the constant company of sound and screen and social contact. This discomfort is not accidental. It is cultivated. The attention economy that profits from your engagement needs you to be uncomfortable with silence. Because the moment you are comfortable with silence, you become significantly harder to distract. And a person who is no longer easily distracted is a person who has recovered something essential. The ability to access their own mind on their own terms at will. But this chapter is about something more than the avoidance of distraction. Important as that is, it is about the specific and irreplaceable role that stillness and solitude play in the development of genuine mental strength. Because the practices you have been building throughout this audiobook, the self-awareness, the emotional regulation, the ability to observe your own patterns with clarity and distance. None of these can be fully developed in the constant company of noise and stimulation. They require silence. They require the particular quality of attention that only becomes available when the external inputs have been quieted and the mind is left to do what it naturally does when given the space to do it, which is to process, to integrate, to reveal, and to restore. Consider what actually happens in your mind when you sit in genuine silence for an extended period initially. And this is the part most people never get past. There is discomfort. The mind that has been conditioned to constant stimulation finds the absence of it threatening. Thoughts come fast, urgent, often anxiety-tinged. The impulse to reach for the phone, to turn on music, to find something, anything to look at or listen to is immediate and intense. Most people comply with this impulse and conclude that silence is not for them. That they are the kind of person who needs noise, who cannot sit still, who does not meditate or do whatever the uncomfortable thing is being asked of them. But this conclusion is premature. It is based on the experience of the first few minutes, not on what lies on the other side of that discomfort. What lies on the other side is something quite different. As the urgency of the initial discomfort settles, and it does settle, if you stay, something begins to open. The mind starts to move more slowly. Thoughts that were previously too quick to catch begin to surface at a pace where they can be observed. Feelings that were being drowned out by activity reveal themselves clearly. Insights arrive that would have been impossible in the noise, connections between things. Understandings about situations, clarities about what you actually want and value and need that simply cannot be accessed when the external environment is constantly competing for bandwidth. This is not mysticism. It is neuroscience. The brain has a network of activity, sometimes called the default mode network, that activates specifically during periods of rest and inward attention. This network is associated with self-reflection, with the integration of experience with perspective taking, with the kind of deep creative and analytical thinking that solves problems that focused effortful attention cannot crack. The default mode network cannot activate fully when you are constantly feeding the brain external stimulation. It needs silence. It needs space. And when you give it that space regularly, what it produces is profound. The role of solitude in building mental strength is related to this but distinct. Solitude is not merely the physical absence of other people. It is the psychological condition of being fully with yourself, your own company, your own thoughts, your own inner life, without the overlay of social performance or the subtle pressure of being witnessed. Most people spend very little time in genuine solitude. They are either with others or consuming media or doing tasks that keep the attention externally focused. The result is that they have only a shallow acquaintance with their own interior world. They know their opinions and preferences at a surface level but have little access to the deeper currents of what they actually feel, what they actually fear, what they actually need, and who they actually are. When nobody is watching and there is nothing to perform. This matters for mental strength because the strength you are building must belong to you in a way that is independent of validation, of company, of external confirmation that you are doing well. The person who can only feel settled when surrounded by others. Who can only feel certain of themselves when receiving approval. Who needs constant social input to maintain their sense of who they are. That person is structurally dependent on conditions they cannot control. When those conditions change, their stability changes with them. The person who has developed a genuine secure relationship with their own inner life through regular solitude carries their stability inside them. They can be alone and feel whole. They can be unseen and still know their own worth. They can be without the external noise and find in the silence not emptiness but a depth of self that no amount of stimulation could have produced. The practice of cultivating stillness and solitude does not require dramatic retreat from ordinary life. It requires only the deliberate carving out of regular protected time in which you are genuinely alone and genuinely quiet. A walk without the earphones. A morning that begins before the phone is touched. 10 minutes of sitting in genuine stillness. Not trying to achieve anything. Not performing meditation for the sake of it. But simply being present to your own experience as it is. The consistency of the practice matters far more than its duration. 10 minutes of genuine daily solitude will do more for your mental strength over a year than occasional hours that are abandoned the moment life becomes busy. What you are building through this practice is a home inside yourself that you can return to regardless of what the external world is doing. A place of inner reference that does not shift with circumstances or moods or the opinions of others. The mentally strong have this home and they return to it often not as an escape from life but as a foundation for it. A place from which they can see clearly, choose deliberately and move with the kind of grounded confidence that is only possible for someone who genuinely knows themselves. And that knowing, deep, honest, unperformed knowing of the self is one of the greatest sources of strength available to any human being. There is one more gift that regular stillness gives you, and it is the gift of genuine creativity. Not creativity in the narrow sense of artistic production, but in the broader, more essential sense of the capacity to generate new thinking, new solutions, new perspectives, new ways of framing old problems. This kind of thinking does not happen in noise. It cannot be forced by staring harder at the problem or working longer hours at the desk. It arises specifically in the periods of mental relaxation and open unfocused awareness that most people have systematically eliminated from their lives. The famous examples are plentiful and consistent across centuries. The insight that arrives in the shower, the solution that surfaces during a walk, the sudden clarity that comes in the half-awake state between sleep and waking. These are not coincidences. They are the predictable output of a brain that has been given, however briefly, the space to operate in a mode that active directed effort cannot access. Every time you protect a period of genuine stillness in your day, you are not merely resting. You are creating the conditions under which the most interesting and original thinking you are capable of becomes possible in a world where the ability to solve the right problems at the right moment can determine the entire shape of a life. That creative capacity is not a luxury. It is an asset of the highest order. One that silence builds and noise destroys quietly every single day. Chapter 12. The Power of Purpose. How a reason to endure makes you truly unbreakable. There is a question that every human being at some point in their life is forced to confront. It usually arrives not in moments of ease, but in moments of genuine suffering, in the long dark nights when nothing is working. When the cost of continuing seems impossibly high. When the rational calculus seems to suggest that going on is simply not worth the pain it requires. The question is this: why? Why endure this? Why keep going? Why not simply give up? Withdraw. Settle for something smaller and easier and less painful. And in those moments, the answer that you carry or fail to carry to that question will determine more about your fate than any skill or strategy or technique this audio book or any other could ever offer you. The answer to why is not a nice to have. It is the load-bearing wall of mental strength. Everything else leans on it. The psychologist Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of a Nazi concentration camp, arrived at what he considered the most important insight of his life and his career. Human beings can endure almost any what if they have a strong enough why. He watched people survive conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. Not because they were physically stronger or more strategically skilled, but because they had found or maintained a sense of meaning, a reason beyond mere survival that made survival feel worth it. And he watched others, physically comparable, collapse, and give up not from the severity of the conditions, but from the absence of any reason they could find to endure them. This observation was not theoretical. It was witnessed in the most extreme conditions human beings have ever created. And its implication is both sobering and electrifying. The most powerful resource available to any human being navigating difficulty is not physical capacity or intellectual ability or strategic advantage. It is meaning. It is purpose. It is the presence of a reason that is larger than the suffering currently being endured. Purpose operates on mental strength in several distinct and compounding ways. The first is motivational. A person with a clear and deeply felt sense of purpose has access to a reservoir of motivation that is fundamentally different in kind from the surface-level motivation of mood, of inspiration, of things going well. Surface motivation is easy and pleasant when conditions are favorable. It evaporates under pressure in difficulty in the long middle section of any important endeavor where the initial excitement has faded and the payoff is not yet visible. Purpose-driven motivation does not evaporate. It is precisely in the hard middle when mood motivation has gone that purpose shows up as the steady, quiet, reliable engine that keeps things moving. Not because the person enjoys the difficulty, but because they have connected what they are doing to something large enough to make the difficulty worth bearing. The second way purpose builds mental strength is through what might be called suffering tolerance. The capacity to endure pain, frustration, setback, and exhaustion for longer and with greater equanimity when those experiences are perceived as meaningful rather than arbitrary. The same level of pain experienced in the context of a purpose larger than yourself is genuinely more bearable than pain experienced for no discernible reason. This is not merely psychological perception. It reflects in physiological measurements. The body under purposeful stress carries itself differently from the body under purposeless stress. The former activates the same stress response mechanisms, but is accompanied by neurochemical and hormonal patterns more consistent with challenge than with threat patterns that support engagement and persistence rather than collapse and withdrawal. The third way purpose builds strength is through the provision of direction during chaos. When life becomes genuinely chaotic, when multiple things are falling apart simultaneously, when you cannot see a clear path forward, when the decisions required of you are complex and the information available to you is incomplete. Purpose functions as a navigational anchor. It does not answer every question. It does not resolve the chaos, but it tells you which direction to face. It tells you what you are trying to protect and build and become in the midst of everything else coming apart around you. And that directional clarity, even when tactical clarity is completely absent, is enough to keep you moving rather than paralyzed. Here is what is important to understand about purpose. It is not always grand. It does not need to be a globally significant mission or a world-changing ambition to function as the psychological anchor that it is. Purpose can be found in the raising of children with love and intentionality, in the craft of a skill practiced with genuine devotion, in the commitment to being someone that the people who depend on you can rely on without question, in the patient, consistent building of something, a business, a relationship, a body of knowledge, a community that matters to you in ways that have nothing to do with how it is perceived by others. What matters is not the scale of the purpose, but its authenticity. A small, genuinely felt purpose is infinitely more powerful than a grand but hollow ambition. The question to ask is not what should my purpose be, as if there is a correct answer to discover, but what do I actually care about enough that I would endure difficulty for it? What, when everything else is stripped away, would I still choose to show up for? The answer to that question followed honestly and with commitment is purpose enough to carry you through a great deal. There is also the dimension of purpose that extends beyond the individual. The experience of being part of something larger than your own life, your own story, your own ambitions. This might be a relationship, a family, a community, a cause, a tradition, a field of work that serves others. Research on resilience and meaning consistently finds that people who have a strong sense of connection to something beyond themselves demonstrate higher levels of every metric of psychological well-being and mental strength. They bounce back faster from adversity. They report higher levels of meaning and lower levels of existential anxiety. They are more generous with their resources, including their time and attention and emotional energy, and they experience that generosity not as a cost but as a source of replenishment. Service to something beyond the self turns out to be one of the most reliable sources of the kind of deep, sustaining satisfaction that purely self-oriented pursuits rarely provide. If you do not yet have a clear sense of purpose, this is not a problem to be solved quickly. It is an invitation to exploration, to paying close attention to what consistently moves you, what consistently engages your deepest interest, what you find yourself caring about, even when there is no external reward for caring. Purpose is not usually arrived at through a single moment of revelation. It is more often discovered gradually through the accumulation of experience and the honest examination of what that experience has revealed about what matters to you. The work of this chapter is simply to take that examination seriously, because in the long run the strength of your mental architecture is only as great as the depth of the foundation it rests on, and that foundation is purpose. Chapter 13. Mastering Failure. How to fall without being destroyed and rise without losing perspective. Failure is the experience that separates people more decisively than almost any other. Not because some people fail and others do not. Everyone who ever attempts anything of significance will fail repeatedly in ways that matter. But because the relationship each person has with failure, the meaning they construct around it, the speed and direction of their response to it, determines everything that comes after. Two people can experience identical failures and be sent in completely opposite directions by them. One contracts, withdraws, concludes that the failure confirms their deepest fears about themselves and gradually stops attempting anything risky enough to produce it again. The other processes the failure, extracts what it teaches, and uses the experience as calibration for the next attempt, arriving at it, not diminished. but informed. What explains the difference is not intelligence, not talent, not some mysterious quality of character bestowed at birth. It is the way each person has learned to relate to the experience of failing. And that relationship is entirely learnable and entirely changeable starting now. Begin with the most important reframe in this entire chapter. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is a component of success, one of its most essential components. In fact, the one from which the most durable learning reliably comes. This is not a comfortable thing to say in the immediate aftermath of something going seriously wrong. And this chapter is not asking you to feel good about failure while it is happening. It is asking you to build over time an understanding of what failure actually is so that when it arrives and it will, your relationship to it does not send you in the wrong direction. Every person who has built something of genuine significance has a failure history that most observers never see. The companies celebrated as extraordinary successes launched failed products first. The artists whose work is now considered masterful produced early work that was rejected, ignored, or simply not good. The athletes at the pinnacle of their sport have lost more times than anyone keeps track of. The pattern is not that successful people fail less. It is that they fail more often, more thoroughly, more publicly in many cases because they are attempting things at the edge of their capacity rather than staying safely within it. The volume of their failure is a direct function of the scale of their ambition and the seriousness of their effort. And the reason they succeed where others do not is not that they are immune to the pain of failure, but that they have developed a relationship with that pain that processes it quickly, extracts its teaching and returns them to productive action rather than keeping them paralyzed. The first skill of failure mastery is what might be called rapid processing. The ability to move through the emotional response to failure without either suppressing it or drowning in it. The emotional response to failure is real and it deserves to be honored. Disappointment is real. Frustration is real. The sting of having invested yourself in something that did not work is real. These are not signs of weakness. They are the appropriate human responses to having cared about an outcome that did not materialize. The mistake is not in feeling them. The mistake is in either refusing to feel them at all, pushing them down in an attempt to appear unbothered, which ensures they will resurface later with more force, or in staying inside them so long that they calcify into the fixed beliefs that failure is your destiny and effort is pointless. Rapid processing looks like this. You allow yourself to feel the disappointment fully without judgment for a defined and limited period. You name what you are feeling. You do not perform resilience for an audience that is not there. And then, and this is the crucial step, you turn the attention from the feeling toward the information. What can this failure actually teach? Not what does it mean about me as a person, which is the wrong question entirely, but what does it reveal about what I did, what I missed, what needs to be different in the next attempt. Failure is almost always informative. It contains within it a diagnosis of something that was not yet developed enough, not yet understood deeply enough, not yet executed skillfully enough. That diagnosis is enormously valuable. It is in fact the most direct and reliable form of feedback available, far more informative than success, which often obscures its own causes and teaches less than it appears to. The second skill is the separation of performance from identity. This is the distinction that determines whether failure breaks a person or informs them. When your identity is fused with your performance, when doing well means you are worthy and doing poorly means you are not, then every failure is existential. It is not just that the project failed or the presentation missed or the relationship ended. It is that you failed. You are inadequate. You are fundamentally not enough. This fusion of performance and identity is enormously common and enormously damaging. It produces people who are either terrified to attempt anything where failure is possible or people who push themselves to perform at any cost, including the cost of their own well-being, because the alternative, being seen to fail, feels like the destruction of the self. The antidote is to build your identity on what does not change with performance, on your values, your effort, your commitment to growth, your way of treating people, your willingness to keep showing up. These are the things that remain constant whether a particular attempt succeeds or not. You can have produced a poor result and still have integrity. You can have failed at something important and still be someone worth knowing. You can have fallen short and still be someone in the process of becoming. When your identity is grounded in these constants rather than in the variable of outcome, failure loses its existential charge. It becomes what it always should have been. Information about what needs to improve, not evidence of who you fundamentally are. The third skill is what might be called the athlete's return. The practiced deliberate movement back into engagement after a setback, executed with appropriate speed, and without the kind of extended analysis that begins as reflection and gradually becomes rumination. There is a window of time after a failure during which reflection is highly productive, the extraction of lessons, the identification of what needs to change, the recalibration of the approach. But that window has a ceiling beyond a certain point. Continued analysis of the failure shifts from productive learning into something that serves a different, less helpful function. The avoidance of the next attempt. Staying in the analysis phase keeps you safely away from the possibility of failing again. It feels like diligence. It feels like you are being thorough and responsible. But often it is simply fear of re-engagement wearing the mask of preparation. The return must happen, and it must happen before you feel entirely ready, because the feeling of being entirely ready rarely arrives on its own. It arrives as a consequence of returning to the arena, not as a prerequisite for it. There is something else worth naming about failure that rarely gets said, and it is this. The people who are most destroyed by failure are very often not the ones who tried their hardest and fell short. They are the ones who never fully committed in the first place, who held something back, who hedged their effort, who kept a private escape route open just in case, and who then, when things went wrong anyway, found themselves with neither the result nor the comfort of knowing. They gave everything they had. The half-hearted attempt that fails leaves you with nothing to work with. The wholehearted attempt that fails leaves you with everything: the knowledge of your own capacity to commit fully, the clear diagnostic of what the next attempt needs to look like, and the irrefutable evidence that you are someone who goes all the way even when the outcome is uncertain. That last piece is not a small thing. It is a piece of self-knowledge and self-respect that accumulates across every serious attempt, whether it succeeds or not, and that builds over time into the kind of deep confidence that no amount of carefully managed success could produce. Fail fully, learn thoroughly, return deliberately. That is the complete practice of mastering failure, and it is one of the most important practices in this entire audiobook. Chapter 14. The long game: building the patience and perspective that outlast any storm. We live in a world that is profoundly hostile to the long game. Everything in the environment of modern life is organized around the short term. The quick result, the immediate feedback, the fast return, the optimization of this quarter, this week, this news cycle. The platforms that mediate so much of human attention operate on reward cycles measured in seconds. The culture of productivity celebrates the hustle and the hack and the shortcut. The self-help industry, with the best of intentions, consistently promises transformations that are faster and more dramatic than the messy, slow, unglamorous reality of genuine change. And the result of all of this is a population of people who have been progressively conditioned to expect immediacy and to experience the natural pace of meaningful development as failure. When growth does not come fast enough, they conclude it is not coming at all. When progress is too slow to see, they conclude they are not making any. And then they quit or pivot or start over, and the cycle begins again. Building unbreakable mental strength requires you to opt out of this conditioning deliberately and completely, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a practical orientation that governs your actual choices and your actual interpretation of how things are going. Because the truth about genuine strength of any kind, mental, physical, relational, professional, is that it develops slowly. Not as slowly as impatience feels, not as impossibly slowly as discouragement would have you believe, but slowly enough that the progress is often invisible in the short term and only unmistakable across the longer arc. The person who practices emotional regulation every day for 2 weeks notices almost nothing. The person who does it for 2 years is unrecognizable to their former self. The gap between those two time scales contains everything. And the only thing that bridges it is the commitment to play the long game even when the long game offers no immediate evidence that it is working. Patience is not a passive quality. This is one of the most important misunderstandings about it. Patient people are not people who have given up caring about outcomes. They are not people who have lowered their standards or resigned themselves to whatever arrives. Patient people are intensely actively engaged with what they are building. They simply have decoupled that engagement from the need for immediate external validation of its progress. They have found a way to be fully invested in the process while holding the outcome lightly enough that the natural fluctuations of any complex endeavor, the setbacks, the plateaus, the periods of apparent stagnation do not destabilize them or cause them to abandon what they are building prematurely. Patience is the companion of genuine commitment. It is what commitment looks like when things are not yet showing results. Developing patience is a genuine capacity, not just the gritted teeth version that pretends to be okay while quietly seething at the slowness of things, requires a fundamental shift in what you measure and what you value. The short game mindset measures outcomes and compares them to expectations. The long game mindset measures process and compares it to yesterday. Short game thinking asks, is this working yet? Long game thinking asks, did I do today what I committed to doing? These are fundamentally different questions, and the answers they generate produce fundamentally different emotional experiences. The person asking whether it is working yet will be anxious and demoralized most of the time because results are typically lagging indicators that take far longer to appear than effort takes to be applied. The person asking whether they did what they committed to today can be satisfied, genuinely fully satisfied with a yes regardless of what the visible results are showing at this particular moment. There is also a dimension of long game thinking that has nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with perspective. The capacity to place whatever is currently difficult within a much larger frame of time. Meaning this is the mental practice of zooming out, of looking at whatever storm you are currently inside and asking not just how do I survive this moment, but where will this moment sit in the arc of my life 5 years from now, 10 years from now, at the very end. This is not a form of minimizing. Some things that happen in a life are genuinely weighty and do not shrink much even when viewed from the end. But many things that feel overwhelming in the moment, the failure that seems catastrophic, the conflict that seems unresolvable, the period of stagnation that seems permanent, look very different from a sufficient distance. The long view does not always make the difficulty smaller, but it almost always makes it more navigable. It restores context that the pressure of the immediate systematically destroys. The most practically powerful form of the long game is what might be called the compound effect of small consistent actions. This is the principle observed across domains from finance to health to skill development, that small actions consistently repeated over long periods produce results that are disproportionately large relative to any individual action taken in isolation. The daily practice that seems trivially small in any single instance accumulates into something transformative over years. The relationship tended with small consistent acts of care becomes something extraordinarily deep over decades. The skill practiced with daily attention for years becomes a profound capability that no shortcut or crash course could approach. The problem is that the compound effect is invisible in the early stages. The early stages feel flat. Progress is real but undetectable. And this is precisely the point at which most people quit, just before the inflection point at which the compounding begins to become visible. Knowing this does not make the early stages of any long game easier exactly, but it makes them more bearable because it replaces the anxiety of I am not seeing results with the understanding that results at this stage are not the point. The point is the practice itself. The point is showing up today and doing the thing. Not because today's instance will produce anything dramatic, but because today's instance is one more brick in a structure that will eventually be impossible to miss. Play the long game not as a consolation for the absence of quick results, but as the deliberate, informed choice of someone who understands how meaningful things are actually built slowly, quietly, consistently, one ordinary day at a time, long after the people who needed faster results have moved on to the next thing. The final piece of long-game thinking is the willingness to endure extended uncertainty, to operate effectively and maintain your direction even when you cannot see clearly where things are going. This is perhaps the most demanding aspect of the long game, because uncertainty is genuinely uncomfortable and the human mind is not naturally at ease with open loops, with unresolved questions, with journeys that have not yet shown their destination. The mind wants closure. It wants to know how the story ends. And when it cannot have that, it will generate its own endings. And the endings it generates under conditions of uncertainty are almost always more negative than the eventual reality. Learning to hold uncertainty without collapsing it prematurely into a conclusion, especially a pessimistic one, is one of the most sophisticated and most valuable mental capacities a person can develop. It is the capacity that allows you to keep building in the dark, to keep moving forward when the path is not yet visible, to trust the direction even when you cannot see the destination. And that trust built through the practice of the long game is ultimately what allows you to arrive at places that impatience would never have found. What helps enormously in developing this tolerance for uncertainty is the cultivation of what might be called process confidence. A trust not in the outcome which you cannot control, but in the quality and consistency of what you are doing which you can process. Confidence says, I do not know exactly where this is going, but I know that what I am doing every day is the right kind of effort applied with the right kind of attention in the right direction, and that is enough to justify continuing regardless of what the results are showing right now. This is a fundamentally different and far more stable place to stand than outcome confidence, which requires the visible evidence of progress to remain intact and collapses the moment that evidence disappears. Process confidence holds through the plateau. It holds through the period of apparent stagnation. It holds through the valley between peaks that every significant developmental arc contains. And because it holds through all of those things, it is the form of confidence that actually gets you to the other side, to the point where the compound effect becomes visible, where the investment of all those ordinary consistent days finally materializes into something you can see and touch and know is real. Chapter 15. Living it: How to carry everything you have built into every single day that remains. You have come a long way. Not just through the chapters of this audiobook, but through the internal territory they represent. You have looked honestly at how your mind works under pressure. You have understood the biology of your own stress response and developed a new relationship with it. You have examined the patterns that were keeping you fragile, the fears you were allowing to make your decisions, the identities you had inherited rather than chosen. You have built in the course of this listening a framework for a different way of being in the world. A way grounded not in the hope that circumstances will become easier, but in the knowledge that you are becoming stronger. And now comes the part that every audiobook, every course, every program of self-development ultimately arrives at. And that is in many ways the hardest part of all. The part where you take what you have learned and make it real. Not in the controlled environment of listening and reflecting, but in the full, unpredictable, relentlessly ordinary chaos of your actual daily life. Because here is what no one tends to tell you and what would be dishonest to withhold. The knowledge without the practice is meaningless. Understanding something is not the same as being changed by it. You can absorb everything in this audiobook and come away feeling genuinely inspired and genuinely informed, and have that feeling fade within a week. Not because the content was not valuable, but because inspiration without implementation is just entertainment. The only thing that makes this material real is what you do with it after the listening ends. And what you do with it is determined more than by anything else by the systems you build and the environment you create to support the daily practice of everything you have learned. The first and most important principle of living this material is that it must become habitual rather than effortful. This sounds contradictory. You have been building skills throughout this entire audiobook, and skills require effort. But there is a distinction between the initial effort of learning a skill and the ongoing relationship you have with that skill once it has been integrated into your daily pattern. The goal is not to be someone who sometimes practices emotional regulation when they remember to. The goal is to be someone for whom the pause before responding, the naming of emotion, the deliberate breath in a moment of pressure has become so thoroughly practiced that it happens naturally, automatically without requiring the conscious mobilization of effort every time. That level of integration only happens through repetition that is consistent enough and sustained enough to shift the behavior from conscious choice to habitual pattern. And that means finding ways to embed the practices into the structure of your day rather than leaving them to the uncertainty of when I feel like it. Examine your daily structure honestly. Where are the moments that reliably trigger your most reactive, most fragile, most easily destabilized responses? The morning scroll before you have even fully woken up, already feeding the anxious mind before it has had a chance to establish its own ground. The transition from work to home that carries the unprocessed stress of the day directly into the relationships that matter most to you. The lying awake at night with a racing mind reviewing everything that went wrong and projecting it onto tomorrow. These are not random vulnerabilities. They are predictable features of your particular daily rhythm. And predictable vulnerabilities can be met with deliberate interventions that over time reshape the pattern entirely. Build rituals of return moments woven deliberately into your day that serve as anchors that bring you back to the grounded, regulated, present version of yourself that you are working to make your default. The morning ritual that does not begin with the phone. The midday pause, however brief, that allows the nervous system to reset before the afternoon's demands. The transition practice: a walk, a few minutes of stillness, a deliberate change of environment that separates the professional self from the relational self with enough space to prevent the former from contaminating the latter. The evening reflection that is not rumination but a brief honest accounting of the day. What you handled well, what you would do differently, what you are grateful for, what you intend for tomorrow. These rituals do not need to be elaborate. They need to be consistent. Consistency is what transforms them from nice ideas into genuine architecture. The second principle of living this material is that you must accept honestly and without resentment that you will not always get it right. This is not a concession to mediocrity. It is a realistic acknowledgement of what growth actually looks like from the inside. Growth is not linear. It does not look like a steadily upward line on a graph. It looks like a generally upward trend with significant variation. Good days, hard days, days when everything you have built seems to hold without effort, and days when you revert to the very patterns you thought you had outgrown. This variation is not failure. It is the natural rhythm of a living, learning human being operating in a complex world. The mistake is in treating every regression as evidence that you have not actually changed, as proof that all of this was wishful thinking. It is not. Regression is data, not verdict. It tells you where the work is not yet complete, which parts of the pattern need more attention, where the old neural pathway is still more accessible than the new one you are building. Use that information. Do not be undone by it. The third principle is that you do not do this alone. This is not a weakness. It is a design feature of human beings who are not built for isolation and who develop their capacities most fully in the context of genuine relationship. Identify the people in your life who support the version of you that you are becoming. Not the people who are comfortable with the version of you that you are leaving behind, but the people who hold space for your growth, who model the qualities you are working to develop, who tell you the truth with enough care that you can actually hear it. Invest in those relationships with the same intentionality you are bringing to every other practice in this audio book. And if those relationships do not yet exist in your life at the level you need, make their cultivation a priority. A community of people committed to genuine growth is not a luxury. For many people, it is the single most powerful factor in whether the commitment to building mental strength endures beyond the initial surge of motivation. The fourth and final principle is perhaps the most important one, and it is this. Make this about something larger than the resolution of your current discomfort. There is nothing wrong with turning to the work of mental strength because you are struggling, because you were in pain, because you need the tools to survive something that is genuinely hard. That is a legitimate and worthy reason to begin. But if the practice ends the moment the immediate crisis passes, you will not have built anything durable. You will have treated mental strength as a remedy rather than a foundation. Which means you will return to it only when the next crisis forces you to. The people who build genuinely unbreakable mental strength are not the people who practice resilience when life requires it. They are the people who have made the development of their inner life a permanent ongoing project. Not because they are always in crisis, but because they understand that the quality of their inner life determines the quality of everything else. Their relationships, their work, their capacity for joy, their ability to be present to the people who matter to them, their response to every situation that life presents, large and small, for the rest of their lives. Everything in this audio book, every insight, every framework, every practice, every reframe has been pointing toward this. A life lived from the inside out rather than from the outside in. A life in which your internal state is not at the mercy of external circumstances, but is instead the foundation from which you meet those circumstances, whatever they are, with clarity and with steadiness and with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who knows what they are made of. You have been given the map. The territory is your life, and you are more ready to navigate it than you have ever been before. The only thing left to do is begin. Not tomorrow. Not when things are calmer or more convenient or more certain. Now, today, in this moment, which is the only one that has ever been available to anyone, and which is yours completely. Mental strength is not a mountain you summit and then descend carrying the certificate of your achievement back into the valley. It is the mountain itself, always there, always available to be climbed further, always offering a higher vantage point from which you can see more clearly and move with greater precision and carry heavier things with less effort. The work you have done in this audio book is not a conclusion. It is a beginning. The beginning of a way of being that will deepen with every year, every difficulty, every ordinary day in which you choose the harder and more honest and more courageous option over the easier one. Every time you make that choice, you are not just solving the immediate problem. You are becoming someone whose foundation holds, someone whose calm is real and not performed, someone who meets the full range of human experience. The grief and the joy, the failure and the triumph, the uncertainty and the clarity, with the kind of open, steady, fully present engagement. That is what a well-lived life is actually made of. That person is already inside you.